The train groaned, a long, mournful sound that settled deep in Clara's bones. For 3 days, its rhythm had been her only companion, the steady clatter of iron on iron, a substitute for a heartbeat she could no longer feel. She sat with her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the blur of the passing landscape, a world of gray dust and brittle sagebrush that stretched into an indifferent horizon. It was a landscape that matched the emptiness inside her. A small, worn leather bag rested on her lap. It held everything she owned in the world: one change of clothes, a bar of lye soap, a handful of coins that felt too light, and a simple gold band. It was not her ring. It was her sister's, given to her on a sun-drenched afternoon that felt like it belonged to another woman's life. Clara's fingers, thin and cold, traced the smooth circle of the ring inside the bag's pocket, clinging to it as a drowning woman might cling to a piece of driftwood. It was a promise of a life that had been denied, a memory of love before love had turned into a weapon. The other reminder of that life was painted on her face, a bruise shaped like a cruel thumbprint, blossomed in shades of violent purple and sickly yellow beneath her left eye. She had tried to hide it with the brim of her bonnet, but she could feel the stares of the other passengers, the quick, averted glances, the whispered judgments that followed her like a shadow. They did not need to know her story to write one for her. A woman traveling alone, marked and silent, was a story that told itself in this part of the country. She closed her eyes, but sleep offered no escape. The rhythmic rocking of the carriage was a cradle that rocked her back into the very memories she was trying to outrun. She saw a parlor, once filled with light and the scent of lemon polish, now thick with the smell of whiskey and stale anger. She saw the heavy set of her husband's shoulders, the tightening of his jaw that came before the storm. He had promised her a fine house, a name of standing, a life of comfort. He had delivered on the house, but he had filled its rooms with fear. His love was a cage, and she had been its willing prisoner until the bars grew too tight to breathe. A low cry from a few seats ahead, a mother shushing her infant, sliced through the haze of her memory. The sound was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, she was back in a small, quiet room, the scent of milk and lavender in the air. She remembered the impossible softness of a tiny hand curled around her finger, the weight of a sleeping child against her chest. A boy, Daniel. A fever had taken him in the space of a single winter week, a swift, merciless thief that had stolen the only light from her world. Her husband had blamed her. Of course, he had called her careless, said she was an unfit mother. His grief had not been a comfort to share, but a cudgel to beat her with. After that, the house had gone from a prison to a tomb. The train's whistle shrieked, a high, piercing sound that pulled her back to the dusty window. The landscape was changing, the flat plains giving way to a high, barren desert flanked by distant, jagged mountains that scraped against a pale sky. The train was slowing, its rhythmic clatter giving way to a series of metallic screeches and hisses of steam. A sign, weathered and sun-bleached, swam into view. Ash Ridge. This was it, the end of the line. She had chosen it from a map, her finger landing on the smallest, most isolated dot she could find. A place to disappear. A place where no one knew her name, or the ruin that had become of it. The train shuddered to a halt. A few rough-looking men in dusty coats and a family with 4 wide-eyed children disembarked, their movements purposeful. Clara waited until the platform was nearly empty before she rose, her legs stiff and unsteady. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, took a deep breath that tasted of coal dust and dry earth, and stepped down from the carriage. The town of Ashridge was little more than a single dirt street carved out of the vast, unforgiving wilderness. A mercantile, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery stable, and a handful of other plain, unpainted wooden buildings stood starkly against the enormous sky. The wind was a constant presence, whipping dust into her eyes and tugging at the frayed edges of her dress. There was no softness here. Everything, the land, the sky, The buildings was hard, weathered, and built for survival. For the first time in days, Clara felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a strange, hollow sort of peace. In a place this empty, perhaps she could be empty too. She walked toward the mercantile, her steps slow and deliberate. She had not eaten a proper meal since she'd left, subsisting on a dry piece of bread and sips of water. Now, the hunger was a dizzying, gnawing ache in her stomach. The world seemed to tilt, the edges of her vision blurring. She reached the wooden porch of the mercantile, her hand outstretched toward the door handle, when the ground rushed up to meet her. But she never hit it. Strong arms, smelling of leather and dust and horse, caught her. The world went dark, but she was not falling. She was being held. Eli Morgan had been loading sacks of flour into his wagon when he saw her. He had noticed her the moment she stepped off the train, a fragile figure in a dark dress, moving like a ghost against the harsh afternoon sun. He had seen women like her before, women running from something, their eyes holding a particular kind of haunted stillness. He knew that look. He saw a version of it in his own reflection every morning. He was a tall man, built lean and hard by years of ranch work. His face was weathered by the sun, creased at the corners of his pale blue eyes. He moved with a quiet economy, a stillness that was not born of peace, but of tightly controlled pain. The war had left him with a limp he rarely acknowledged and memories he could not shake. Then the fire had come years later, a roaring monster that had consumed his small cabin, his wife, and his daughter in a single, terrible night. Now, grief was a second skin he wore, a silent companion on long cattle drives and in the empty quiet of his ranch house. He watched her walk toward the mercantile, her steps faltering. He saw her sway, saw her hand reach out for support that was not there. Before he had time to think, he was moving, crossing the dusty street in 3 long strides, catching her just as her knees buckled. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of bones and worn fabric. He lifted her easily, her head lolling against his shoulder. The bruise on her face was stark and ugly. He felt a familiar, cold anger tighten in his chest, the kind of anger he had learned to bury deep long ago. It did nothing to help the dead, and it only brought trouble to the living. "Someone get Mrs. Grady," he said, his voice low and rough, directed at the gawking onlookers who had started to gather. He carried her down the street to the boarding house, a 2-story building that was the cleanest and sturdiest structure in Ashridge. A woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite stood on the porch, her hands on her hips. This was Martha Grady. Her tongue was as sharp as a skinning knife, but Eli knew that beneath the gruff exterior was a store of kindness she reserved for those who truly needed it. "What in God's name have you got there, Eli?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Fainted," Eli said simply. "Outside the mercantile. Needs a room." Mrs. Grady's sharp eyes took in Clara's pale face, the dark bruise, the thinness of her wrists. She clicked her tongue but opened the door wider. "Bring her in. Put her in the room at the top of the stairs. And for heaven's sake, try not to get dust on my clean floors." Eli carried her up the narrow staircase and laid her gently on the bed in a small, spare room. It contained a simple iron bedstead, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out over the endless, empty plains. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the unconscious woman. She looked impossibly young, her face in repose, stripped of the hardness she had tried to wear like armor. He pulled off his dusty hat, running a hand through his hair, feeling out of place and uncertain. Then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. "Downstairs, Mrs. Grady was already stirring a pot on the stove. "She looks like she's seen the devil himself," the older woman commented without looking up. "Maybe she has," Eli replied, his voice quiet. He placed a few coins on the table. "For the room. And some soup for when she wakes." Mrs. Grady grunted, a sound that was both acknowledgement and dismissal. I'll see to her. You've done your part. Eli nodded, put his hat back on, and walked out into the fading light, the weight of another person's trouble settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. That night, Clara lay awake, listening to the Wyoming wind howl around the corners of the boarding house. It was a lonely, relentless sound, the voice of the wilderness itself. Mrs. Grady had brought her a bowl of thin broth, which she had managed to sip, and had asked no questions, for which Clara was profoundly grateful. But now, in the darkness, the silence of the small room was deafening. Pain was a constant. It was in the throbbing of her eye, the ache of her empty stomach, the deeper, hollow ache in her soul. She thought of Daniel's smile, of her sister's laughter, of a time when her own reflection had not looked back at her with the eyes of a stranger. Had that person ever really existed? She curled onto her side, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin, and wondered if this was all that was left of living. Just the wind, and the darkness, and the pain. The next morning, a knock came at her door. It was him, the man who had caught her. He stood in the doorway, tall and awkward, holding his hat in his hands. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second before glancing away. Mrs. Grady said you were awake, he said. His voice was a low rumble, hesitant. Yes, thank you, Clara whispered, her own voice feeling rusty from disuse. For yesterday. He gave a short, jerky nod. You were in need of help. An awkward silence stretched between them. He seemed as uncomfortable as she felt. He was not a man who was used to making small talk, and she was a woman who had forgotten how. He looked at the floor, then at the window. He was searching for an escape. I'm Eli Morgan, he said finally, as if forcing the words out. Clara hesitated. Her own name felt like a betrayal, a link to a past she needed to sever. I'm Clara. She offered nothing more. He nodded again, seemingly relieved that she did not elaborate. Well, Clara, Mrs. Grady is a fair woman. She'll see you right. He placed his hat back on his head, the gesture a clear signal of his departure. And then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. He had not asked about her eye. He had not asked where she was from, or where she was going. He had simply looked at her with a quiet, unsettling gravity, as if he understood the language of silence. True to Eli's word, Mrs. Grady was fair. When Clara came downstairs, her face scrubbed clean and her hair tidied, she offered her a deal. This ain't a charity house, the woman stated, her arms crossed. But I need help in the kitchen and with the laundry. You earn your keep. You have a room and 3 meals a day. Deal? Deal, Clara said without hesitation. Work was a blessing. It was hard. Physical labor that left her muscles aching and her mind blessedly blank. She peeled potatoes, scrubbed floors, washed mountains of linens until her hands were raw, and fell into bed each night too exhausted for nightmares. She kept to herself, her voice low and her eyes downcast. She was a shadow in the boarding house, and for a while, that was enough. But a town like Ashridge was too small for secrets. Whispers began to follow her like the dust devils that danced down the main street. They started in the saloon among the men, then moved to the mercantile among the women. Who is she? Where did she come from? Look at that bruise on her face. Must have run off from her husband, or maybe she never had one. The whispers were like tiny, stinging insects. Clara did her best to ignore them, to build a wall of silence and hard work around herself. But one afternoon, as she was returning from the mercantile with a basket of supplies, a rancher named Jed, a stout man with a mean look in his eye, stepped in front of her, blocking her path. You're that new woman, he said, his voice thick with drink. He let his gaze travel down her body, slow and insulting. A pretty thing like you, all alone. You for hire? The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. Whore. He did not have to say it. Clara froze. The old fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She could feel the stares of others on the street. Her first instinct was to run, to hide. She thought of her husband's sneering face, the weight of his hand. But then something else rose up in her, something hard and defiant that had been forged in the fires of her suffering. She had not come all this way to be broken by the whispers and leers of another cruel man. Slowly, she lifted her chin. She looked Jed directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold. She said nothing. She simply held his stare until he was the one to look away, shuffling his feet and muttering under his breath. Then, with a quiet dignity she did not know she possessed, she stepped around him and continued walking back to the boarding house, her back straight, the basket clutched tightly in her hands. From across the street, leaning against his wagon, Eli Morgan watched the entire exchange. He had seen Jed approach her, had felt that same cold anger begin to rise. He had started to move, to intervene, but then he stopped. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but he also saw the spark that extinguished it. He saw her straighten her spine, saw the silent, unyielding strength in the way she held herself. He watched her walk away, not in defeat, but in a quiet, powerful retreat. He knew what that cost her. He understood the tremor she was hiding in her hands, the effort it took to keep her chin held high when all she wanted to do was crumble. He saw a strength in her that was born not from an absence of fear, but from the mastery of it. And in that moment, watching the small, solitary figure disappear into the boarding house, he recognized a fellow survivor. He saw the deep, hidden wounds she carried, and for the first time since the fire, he felt something other than the dull ache of his own grief. It was a flicker of connection, as fragile and as real as a spark in the dark. Clara learned that survival was a form of invisibility. She made herself useful in the way a good tool is useful, quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. She rose before the sun, her hands plunged into hot, soapy water, scrubbing the grime from the boarding house linens. She mended torn shirts and scuffed boots for the traveling salesmen and ranch hands who passed through, her stitches small and neat. She even took to cleaning the stables behind the boarding house, the familiar, earthy smell of hay and horse, a strange comfort in a world that had become alien to her. She moved through her days on the periphery, a shadow in the corner of Ashridge's eye. But the town kept watching. Suspicion clung to her like the fine Wyoming dust. When she went to the mercantile for flour or salt, conversations would halt, replaced by a thick, weighted silence. The women of the town, in their starched bonnets and calico dresses, would gather their skirts a little closer as she passed, their eyes like chips of flint. They saw the fading bruise on her cheek, the absence of a ring on her finger, and the quiet, guarded set of her jaw. And from these spare ingredients, they baked a dozen different stories, each one more scandalous than the last. Clara felt their judgment like a physical weight, a constant pressure on her shoulders. She did not need to hear the whispers to know what they were saying. The weather turned in late afternoon. The vast blue sky of the high desert suddenly swallowed by a bruised, turbulent gray. The wind, once a steady companion, turned into a shrieking menace, tearing at the wooden signs and whipping dirt into blinding funnels. Clara had just finished hanging the last of the day's laundry on the line behind the boarding house when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within moments, it was a deluge, a cold, driving sheet of water that plastered her thin dress to her skin and turned the dusty ground to a slick, greedy mud. She worked frantically, her cold, numbed fingers fumbling with the clothespins, trying to rescue the clean sheets before they were ruined. The wind tore a heavy canvas sheet from her grasp, sending it billowing across the yard like a drunken ghost. She lunged for it, slipping in the mud and nearly falling, the rain stinging her face and blurring her vision. She was losing the battle. Suddenly, A tall figure was there beside her, moving with a calm, unhurried purpose that seemed to defy the storm's chaos. It was Eli Morgan. He said nothing, simply reached up and began unpinning the laundry with his large, capable hands. His movements swift and sure. He gathered a heavy armload of wet cloth, then waited for her to do the same. Together, they battled the wind and the rain, two silent figures working in a strange, unspoken rhythm. They made 3 trips, their shoulders brushing in the narrow doorway, until the last of the laundry was piled in a damp heap inside the kitchen. Clara stood there, dripping and shivering, her hair plastered to her scalp. She could not remember the last time someone had helped her without being asked, without the expectation of something in return. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the storm outside. Eli just nodded, his own shirt soaked through, his face grim in the dim light. He looked as if he were about to leave, to retreat back into his own world of silence. But the storm was too fierce. He stood awkwardly by the door, a man clearly uncomfortable with being indoors, with being so close to another person's world. That evening, the storm continued to rage. Mrs. Grady had gone to bed early, leaving Clara to finish cleaning the kitchen by the warm, flickering glow of a single lantern. She was scrubbing a pot when she heard a quiet footstep behind her. It was Eli. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee Mrs. Grady had left on the stove cupped in his hands. He watched her for a long time, the silence broken only by the drumming of rain against the window panes. Finally, Clara put down the pot, her hands aching from the cold and the work. She turned to face him, leaning back against the sink. "I have found," she began, her voice low and steady, "that there is no such thing as kindness without a cost. Sooner or later, the bill always comes due." She was not looking at him, but at the lantern flame, watching it dance and cast long, wavering shadows across the room. She was speaking not just of him, but of her entire life, of a world that had taught her that every gentle touch had a price, every soft word a hidden hook. Eli did not move. He did not offer a denial or a comforting platitude. He did not tell her she was wrong, that some people were just good. He simply sat there in the flickering light, listening. He let her words hang in the air, let their weight settle in the small, warm kitchen. His silence was a form of respect, an acknowledgement of her truth without judgment. He was letting her own her pain. For Clara, who had spent years being told that her pain was her own fault, or worse, that it did not exist at all, his quiet listening was a more profound act of kindness than any words could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, cutting through the sound of the storm. "My ranch is short-handed," he said, changing the subject so abruptly it almost startled her. "2 of my hands heard about the gold strikes up in the Black Hills and left without a word. I need someone to help with the stock, mend fences. The work is hard. The pay is not much, but it comes with a roof and meals." Clara stared at him, taken aback. She knew nothing of ranch work. She was a woman alone, a stranger. The offer made no sense. "Why me?" "Because you are not afraid of work," he said simply. "And because the whispers in this town are getting louder. My ranch is a long way from town. The only voices you will hear out there are the wind and the cattle." He was offering her a refuge, not a rescue, a chance to trade the prison of town gossip for the vast, empty freedom of the plains. She hesitated, the fear of the unknown warring with the misery of the known. To go with him would be to place her trust in a man she barely knew, to step even further into isolation. But to stay meant slowly suffocating under the weight of suspicion and scorn. "I will think on it," she said softly. "I will be in town for supplies tomorrow morning," he said, rising from the table. "Let me know then." He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the latch. "The cost," he said, his back still to her, "is that you do the work you are paid for. Nothing more." And then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. The next morning, When Eli Morgan loaded his wagon and prepared to leave Ashridge, Clara was standing beside it, her single bag in her hand. She had already said her goodbyes to Mrs. Grady, who had simply grunted and pressed a small, lumpy parcel of bread and cheese into her hands. The ride to the ranch was silent. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, the space between them a gulf of unspoken histories. The landscape unfolded around them, a vast, rolling sea of brown grass and gray sage under an immense sky. The silence was different here. It was not the suffocating silence of a judgmental town, but a living, breathing silence, full of the rustle of the wind and the cry of a distant hawk. The ranch was modest, a small, sturdy house and a large barn nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the winds by a low ridge. It was a place built for function, not comfort, but it was clean and well kept. Eli showed her to a small room off the kitchen, once likely belonging to a hired hand. It was spare, but it was hers. The days that followed were the hardest of Clara's life. Eli was a patient but demanding teacher. He taught her how to mend a split-rail fence, the sharp bite of the wire against her soft hands. He taught her how to groom a horse, the feel of the animal's powerful muscles beneath her touch. He taught her how to ride, not side-saddle like a proper lady, but astride like a man, a shocking and liberating freedom. Her body ached with a deep, cleansing soreness, and at night she fell into a dreamless sleep the moment her head hit the pillow. Slowly, the rhythms of the ranch began to seep into her. She learned the sound of the horses nickering for their morning feed, the smell of the air before a rainstorm, the way the light of the setting sun turned the plains to gold and fire. For the first time, she felt her own strength, not just the strength to endure, but the strength to do. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, her eyes fell upon a small, glinting object. It was a man's wedding band, plain and worn, hanging on a nail by the doorframe. She stared at it, her chest tightening. It was a ghost, a silent testament to a life that had existed here before her. Just then, Eli came out of the house. He saw where she was looking, saw the question in her eyes. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of a deep, relentless pain. He said nothing, and she looked away, a silent understanding passing between them. They were both haunted. A few days later, they were sitting on the porch steps at the end of a long day, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. "Clara," she said into the quiet, "my name is Clara." It was the first piece of herself she had offered freely. Eli looked at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. He nodded slowly. "I am not asking," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You are here. That is enough." His words were a gift. He was not digging for her past, not trying to unearth the secrets that had driven her here. He was accepting her, the person she was now. In this place, it was a kind of grace she had never known. The peace she was beginning to find was fragile, and one night, it shattered. She woke to a sound, a horse's panicked whinny from the corral. Slipping out of bed, she pulled on her boots and a shawl and crept outside. The moon was high and bright, washing the landscape in a ghostly silver light. The horses were restless, but that was not what had woken her. There was another sound, a low, ragged noise coming from the low ridge behind the house. She followed the sound, her heart pounding. There, kneeling in the tall grass, was Eli. A half-empty whiskey bottle lay on the ground beside him. He was drunk, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen, his usual iron control completely gone. He was kneeling before two small, simple wooden crosses, barely visible in the moonlight. He was not crying, but a sound of pure, animal grief was being torn from his throat. Clara stopped, hidden in the shadows. This was a private sorrow, a sacred space. She should turn back, leave him to his ghosts. But her feet would not move. She remembered her own nights of howling grief, the crushing loneliness of it. Slowly, quietly, She walked forward. He did not seem to notice her until she was right there. Then he looked up, his eyes unfocused and swimming with a pain so vast it stole her breath. She did not speak. There were no words for this kind of loss. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She knelt in the grass beside him. She did not touch him, did not offer a single word of comfort. She just knelt there, a silent witness to his sorrow, sharing the vigil under the cold, silent moon. He did not speak of them, the wife and child who slept beneath the crosses, but in the shared silence of that night, she knew. The world, however, would not leave them to their quiet peace. A neighboring rancher, a man named Cal Tilden, began to take an unwelcome interest in Eli's new hired hand. Tilden was a bitter, entitled man whose own ranch was failing due to his laziness and cruelty. He saw Eli's quiet success as a personal insult, and he saw Clara as a weakness to be exploited. The rumors started in the saloon, fueled by Tilden's whiskey-soaked pronouncements. He called her Eli's whore, a fallen woman he had picked up for his own use. He claimed her presence was a stain on the decency of the territory, a danger to their good, God-fearing families. The poison spread quickly, finding fertile ground in the town's suspicion. One Sunday, desperate for a connection to something beyond the ranch, Clara rode into town for the church service. She sat alone in the back pew, feeling the weight of 100 hostile stares. During the sermon, she overheard 2 women whispering in the pew in front of her. "That is her," one said, her voice a hiss. "The one living out at the Morgan place. They say she is a runaway from back east, probably a whore hiding from the law." "Or a widow with something to hide," the other added, her voice dripping with righteous satisfaction. No decent woman would live alone with a man like that. Each word was a stone, bruising her in a way no fist ever could. The air in the church became thick, suffocating. She could not breathe. Pushing herself to her feet, she fled, her face burning with shame and anger, the sermon on forgiveness ringing hollowly in her ears. She walked, leading her horse, not wanting to get back on, just needing the feel of the solid earth beneath her feet. The road back to the ranch stretched long and empty before her. She was alone again, truly alone. The fragile peace she had built was a house of cards, and the town's cruel whispers were the wind that had just blown it all down. She did not know how long she had been walking when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. She did not have to turn around to know who it was. Eli rode up beside her on his big roan, his shadow falling over her. He slowed his horse to match her walking pace. He did not ask her why she had left the church. He did not ask her what was wrong. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He simply rode beside her, a silent, solid presence against the vast emptiness of the plains. He was a shield, a guardian, a quiet promise that whatever demons she was facing, she would not have to face them alone. The silence that stretched between them on that long walk home was more comforting than any words could ever be. Cal Tilden did not bother with the front gate. He rode his horse straight across Eli's pasture, a deliberate act of disrespect, and reined in a few yards from the porch where Eli was mending a harness. He was a man who carried his bitterness like a brand, his face florid and his mouth set in a permanent sneer. He sat atop his horse, looking down at Eli with an air of smug authority. "Morgan," he began, foregoing any greeting. "I have come out here as a neighbor, a concerned neighbor." Eli did not look up from his work. He continued to pull the waxed thread through the thick leather, his movements slow and precise. "You are not my neighbor, Tilden, and your concern is not welcome here." Tilden's face tightened. "It is the woman, Clara." He spat the name as if it were poison. "The town is talking. They are saying you are keeping a whore out here. It is a risk to your reputation, to all our reputations. It sets a bad example. A man of your standing. People looked up to you after your troubles." The mention of his past, the casual way Tilden invoked the fire and the loss of his family, sent a cold, hard knot of rage tightening in Eli's gut. Still, he did not move. He finished his stitch, pulled it taut, and only then did he slowly raise his head. His eyes, pale and cold as a winter sky, met Tilden's. "My reputation," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my business. Who I have on my land is my business. This is the only time I will tell you this. Tilden, get off my property. Do not come back. And do not ever speak her name again." There was no shouting, no overt threat, but the finality in Eli's tone was as absolute as a locked door. Tilden, for all his bluster, was a coward at his core. He saw something in Eli's eyes that made him pull back on his reins. He muttered a curse, wheeled his horse around so violently that it tore up the turf, and galloped away, his back rigid with fury and humiliation. Eli watched him go, then methodically returned to his work. But the peace of the afternoon had been broken. A week later, the wind came. It was not the usual prairie wind. This was a malevolent force, a howling dervish that screamed down from the mountains and slammed into the small ranch. It flattened the grass, tore at the roof of the house, and shrieked through every crack and crevice. For 2 days, Eli and Clara were prisoners indoors, the world outside a raging blur of dust and noise. On the second night, a sound like a giant's fist striking the earth shook the house to its foundations. It was a deafening crack of splintering timber, followed by a long, groaning crash. When the wind finally died down at dawn, they went outside to survey the damage. A huge section of the barn roof had been torn away, its heavy beams and timbers scattered across the corral like broken bones. The interior of the barn was exposed to the sky, a chaotic mess of hay, tools, and debris. It was a devastating blow, a winter's worth of repairs and a season's worth of hay ruined. Clara looked at the destruction, then at Eli's face. His expression was grim, his jaw tight as he calculated the cost, the time, the labor. She saw the weight of it settle on his shoulders. "I can help," she said, her voice small but firm against the morning quiet. He looked at her, about to refuse, to tell her it was a man's work, too heavy, too dangerous, but he saw the resolve in her eyes, the same quiet strength he had seen that day in town. He gave a single, curt nod. And so they began to rebuild. It was brutal, back-breaking work. They salvaged what timber they could, pulling splintered beams from the wreckage, prying out bent nails one by one. They cleared the debris, their hands becoming scraped and raw. Clara was not as strong as him, but she was tireless. She worked from sunup to sundown, hauling wood, sorting tools, her body screaming with a pain that was clean and honest. A welcome substitute for the other, deeper aches she carried. They worked side by side, a team born of necessity, communicating in shared glances and simple, direct sentences. In the rhythm of the work, in the shared sweat and strain, a new kind of intimacy grew between them, stronger than any conversation. On the third day of their labor, they sat on a pile of salvaged lumber, sharing a dipper of water under the hot afternoon sun. They were both filthy, their clothes stained with dirt and sweat, their muscles trembling with exhaustion. "He used to say I was useless," Clara said suddenly, her voice so low Eli almost did not hear her. She was staring at her own hands, at the blisters and cuts that crisscrossed her palms. "Good for only one thing." Eli waited, knowing that this was not the end of it. The silence stretched, and he let it, giving her the space she needed. "He had debts," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a story about someone else. Gambling debts. He was a man who liked to live well, even when he could not afford it. When the money ran out, he found other ways to pay. He found men who were willing to pay for his wife's company for an evening. She finally looked up at him, her eyes holding a terrible, bleak honesty. She was not asking for pity. She was simply stating a fact, a piece of the past that was as much a part of her as the color of her hair. She was giving him the ugliest, most broken piece of herself, expecting him to recoil, to turn away in disgust as any decent man would. Eli did not flinch. He did not look away. He held her gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet, terrible anger that was not directed at her. He thought of Tilden's smug, cruel face. He thought of her husband, a man he had never met, but now hated with a purity that startled him. He saw the strength it had taken for her to survive that, to escape, to sit here now under the wide, open sky and speak the unspeakable. He reached out and gently took the dipper from her trembling hands. "He is a coward," Eli said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her memory. "You survived him." It was not absolution. It was not pity. It was a statement of fact, a simple and profound acknowledgement of her strength. He did not see her as soiled or ruined. He saw her as a survivor. And with those 4 words, a dam inside Clara that had been holding back years of shame and self-loathing finally broke. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She turned her head away, hiding her face in her shoulder, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She cried for the girl she had been, for the woman she had been forced to become, and for the sudden, terrifying hope that she might one day be whole again. That night, a deep chill settled over the plains. They sat before the stone fireplace in the main room, the fire casting a warm, golden light on their exhausted faces. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a space of unspoken histories, but a shared space of acknowledged pain. Clara was huddled in a blanket, staring into the flames, her eyes still shadowed and raw from her tears. Eli watched her, his heart aching with a protective instinct so fierce it almost choked him. He knew she would retreat back into her shell, that the shame would return with the morning light. He could not let that happen. He moved from his chair to sit on the hearth beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel his presence. He reached out and, with a hesitation that was uncharacteristic for him, gently touched her hand. It was just a touch, his calloused fingers lightly covering hers. Her hand was ice cold. She flinched but did not pull away. "You do not have to be alone tonight, Clara," he said, his voice a quiet murmur, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. It was an offer of solace, not of passion, an offer to stand guard against the nightmares he knew would be waiting for her. She looked at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable in the firelight, searching his face for any sign of motive, any hint of the price that would be demanded for this kindness. She found none. She saw only a quiet, steady compassion, a reflection of her own pain in his weary eyes. "Stay," she whispered, the word a fragile breath. "Just stay." He did not move away, and he did not move closer. He simply kept his hand over hers, a warm, solid weight that anchored her to the present, to the safety of this small room. They did not speak again. The fire burned low. The shadows danced on the walls, and eventually, lulled by the warmth and the profound comfort of another human presence, they both drifted to sleep, still fully clothed, leaning against the rough stone of the fireplace, their heads inches apart. For the first time in years, they were not alone in their darkness. The town of Ashridge, however, was not content to leave them in peace. Cal Tilden, his pride wounded and his hatred stoked, had been busy. He had spoken to the members of the town council, men of similar standing and prejudice, weaving a tale of moral decay and creeping sin out at the Morgan Ranch. He spoke of decency, of protecting their wives and daughters from corrupting influences. The result was a new town ordinance, passed in a swift and nearly unanimous vote. It declared that it was henceforth unlawful for any unmarried woman of ill repute or unknown origin to be employed or housed on a remote ranch or homestead without the presence of a proper female chaperone. The language was vague, But the target was precise. It was a law written for one person. It was a law designed to drive Clara out. "Mrs." Grady brought the news a few days later, her face a mask of thunderous rage. "They did it, the sanctimonious old fools," she announced as she climbed down from her buggy. Eli, helping her, "Passed a rule against you, Tilden's handiwork, no doubt about it. I told them they were a pack of hypocrites, that the girl works harder than any two men in this town and has more decency in her little finger than Tilden has in his whole bloated body. But they would not listen. Her defense of Clara had cost her. "Folks are staying away from the boarding house," she admitted, her voice tight with frustration. "The women clutch their pearls when I walk by. Business is down by half. They are trying to starve us both out." A cold, familiar dread washed over Clara. This was her fault. Her presence was a blight, poisoning the lives of the only two people who had shown her kindness. The shame she had cried out by the fire came rushing back, cold and suffocating. "I have to leave," she said that night, her voice barely audible. They were in the kitchen, the news from Mrs. Grady hanging heavy in the air between them. "I cannot let them hurt you and Mrs. Grady because of me. I will go." "No," Eli said, his voice sharp and absolute. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen. "If you run, you will be giving them power. You will be proving them right. You will spend the rest of your life running from men like Tilden, from towns like Ashridge. Here is where you stop running." "But what can I do?" she cried, her voice breaking. "They have made it the law. They will force me to leave." "Then we will use the law against them," he said, his voice lowering, becoming steady and determined. "Marry me, Clara." She stared at him, speechless. "It would not be a real marriage," he continued quickly, seeing the shock on her face. "Not in the way you think. It would be a shield, a name, my name. They cannot touch the wife of Eli Morgan. The law would be satisfied. Tilden would be silenced. We could go on as we are, right here. It is a solution." His offer was practical, logical. It was an act of protection, the ultimate gesture of defense against a cruel world. But to Clara, it sounded like a cage, albeit a gilded one. A marriage born of shame, a transaction to solve a problem. It was too close to the life she had fled, a life where a woman's worth was tied to a man's name, where she was property to be protected or sold. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I cannot. I thank you for the offer. Eli, it is a kinder offer than I deserve, but I will not trade one kind of shame for another. I will not be your wife out of pity or convenience." She had just begun to discover who Clara was. She could not bear to bury that fledgling person under the name of Mrs. Morgan. She fled the house then, needing to escape the suffocating weight of his offer, of her own impossible situation. She ran, not knowing where she was going, her feet carrying her toward the sound of the creek that cut through the edge of Eli's property. He found her there an hour later, standing ankle-deep in the icy water, the moonlight silvering her pale face. She was scrubbing at her arms with a furious, desperate energy, as if she could wash away not just the day's dirt, but the filth of her entire past. Sobs tore from her throat, raw and ragged sounds of a soul at the end of its endurance. "I am so tired of hurting," she gasped, looking up at him, her face a mess of tears and despair. "I am so tired." He did not speak. He waded into the cold water, his boots sinking into the muddy bank. He reached down and, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he lifted her into his arms. She was limp, all the fight gone out of her. She buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. As he carried her out of the water and back toward the house, he carried her in silence, up the steps, through the quiet rooms, and into his own bedroom. He laid her on top of the quilt, her wet clothes clinging to her. He did not undress her. He simply pulled off her muddy boots, then covered her shivering body with a thick wool blanket. He stood by the bed for a long moment, watching her ragged breathing slow as exhaustion finally claimed her. When Clara woke, the morning sun was streaming through the window. She was alone, tucked tightly into a warm, comfortable bed. She was still in her damp clothes from the night before, but a heavy quilt was pulled up to her chin. For a moment, she was disoriented, the memory of the riverbank, of her own despair, feeling like a distant nightmare. Then she saw the note on the small bedside table. It was a single piece of paper, folded in half. She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened it. There were only 3 words, written in Eli's strong, clear script. "You are safe here." Something shifted in Clara in the quiet hours of that morning, waking in a strange bed, wrapped in a safety she had never known. The note on the bedside table was not a declaration of love, but something far more potent, a statement of fact. You are safe here. Safety was a foundation, a piece of solid ground in the wreckage of her life. And on that solid ground, for the first time, she felt she could stand and fight. The change was not loud. It was a subtle recalibration of her very being. When she and Eli rode into town for supplies later that week, she no longer stared at the ground as she walked. When a group of women outside the mercantile fell into a sudden, pointed silence at her approach, she did not scurry past. She stopped, turned, and met their hostile glares with a calm, steady gaze of her own, holding it until they, one by one, grew uncomfortable and looked away. She did not offer a smile or a word. She simply refused to be invisible any longer. A rancher, complaining about the cost of having his saddlebags repaired, was grumbling to the store owner. Clara, who was waiting to purchase a sack of beans, stepped forward. "I can do it for half that," she said, her voice clear and even. "And I will have it done by tomorrow." The rancher, a man more concerned with his coin than with town gossip, looked her over, shrugged, and agreed. She was no longer just enduring the town's scorn. She was actively carving out a place within its economy, using their judgment as a tool against them. Through it all, Eli was a silent, constant presence at her side. He never spoke for her, never drew his own weapon in her defense, but when she stared down the gossips, he stood a pace behind her, his arms crossed, his stillness a warning. When she made her deal to repair the saddlebags, he loaded their supplies into the wagon, his presence a tacit endorsement of her skill. He was not her champion. He was her shield, an unbreachable wall that gave her the space she needed to find her own sword. The worst of the town's cruelty, the open taunts and sneers, seemed to wither in the face of their quiet, united front. The stagecoach brought the letter on a Tuesday. It was not addressed to her, but to Sheriff Brody, a weary man who seemed permanently caught between his duty and the path of least resistance. He rode out to the ranch that afternoon, his face grim, the official-looking envelope in his hand. "Eli, ma'am," he said, nodding to Clara with a hint of discomfort. "This came. It is from a deputy back in Illinois. It is about your husband. Ma'am." Clara felt the world tilt. She took the letter Sheriff Brody offered her, her fingers suddenly numb. Eli moved to stand closer to her, a silent question in his eyes. Her hands trembled as she read. The words were stark, official. Her husband, Thomas, was dead. He had been shot and killed during a card game that had turned violent, in a brothel. The last, ugly detail felt like a final, fitting epitaph for the man she had married. She felt no grief, no sorrow. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where a heart was supposed to be. A quiet turning of a page on a chapter of her life she thought would never end. She was free. But the letter was not finished. The deputy added a final, chilling paragraph. "Regarding his wife, Clara, who fled some months ago," he wrote. "His family had filed a complaint. She took with her a gold wedding band belonging to her late sister, an item of some value. While the family does not wish to press the matter now that Thomas is gone, the charge of theft is still on the record here. You should know there is a warrant for her." Theft. The word was a slap. Her sister's ring. The one thing she had clung to as a memory of a purer love had been twisted into a crime. The hollow emptiness in her chest was instantly filled with a cold, terrifying dread. Her freedom had lasted for all of 30 seconds. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, unable to meet her eyes. "Clara, I'm sorry, but the law's the law. The town council, Cal Tilden, has been pushing this. They insist I act on it. I have to take you into custody until we can get this sorted out by telegraph." "You will do no such thing," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "I have no choice, Eli," the sheriff said, his expression miserable. "If I do not, they will say I am not doing my job. They will have my badge. They are waiting for me back in town to see it done." Clara looked from the sheriff's apologetic face to Eli's thunderous one. This was her fault. Her past had finally caught up, and now it was a snare that would drag Eli down with her. "It is all right, Eli," she said, her voice a strange, calm whisper. "I will go." The ride into town was a silent agony. Clara sat in the sheriff's buggy, her hands folded in her lap, her back ramrod straight. Eli rode alongside them, his face a mask of cold fury. As they reached the main street, it seemed the entire population of Ashridge had turned out to watch. Faces peered from windows. Men stopped on the boardwalk, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and smug satisfaction. Cal Tilden stood outside the saloon, a triumphant smirk on his face. This was his victory. The jail was a small, stiflingly hot room at the back of the sheriff's office, containing a single cot and a barred window that looked out onto a dusty alley. The clang of the cell door shutting behind her was the sound of a final, irrevocable defeat. She was a prisoner again, just in a different kind of cage. Eli did not stay to watch. As soon as the door was locked, he turned and walked directly into the sheriff's main office. Brody was sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who had just swallowed poison. "She will not be in that cell for long," Eli said, his voice flat and hard. He placed his hands on the sheriff's desk and leaned forward, his presence filling the small room. "My hands are tied. Eli, you know that." "Then untie them," Eli countered. "You know as well as I do that this is Tilden's doing. This town, this whole county, survives because men like me run our cattle through it. My business, and the business of the men who ride for me, keeps that mercantile open. My yearly contribution helps pay for that schoolhouse. The beef I provide feeds this town through the winter." He straightened up, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. "If she is not out of that cell by noon tomorrow, you can consider all of that gone. I will pull my stock. I will drive my cattle through another county. I will take my business and my money elsewhere. And I will make sure every rancher from here to the mountains knows that the law in Ashridge answers to the whims of Cal Tilden. We will see how long your town lasts after that. We will see how long you keep that badge." It was not a plea. It was a promise. Sheriff Brody stared at him, the color draining from his face. He knew Eli Morgan was not a man who made idle threats. The economic ruin Eli had just laid out was not an exaggeration. It was a certainty. "I will send the telegraph tonight," the sheriff said, his voice hoarse. "I will tell them it is urgent." Later, after the sun had set, Eli came to her cell. He stood on the other side of the bars, his face half hidden in the shadows cast by the lantern on the sheriff's desk. "He is sending the telegraph," Eli told her. "They should have an answer by morning." She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The cell was cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. "Thank you, Eli, for everything." "You do not need to thank me." They stood in silence for a long time. She could see the worry etched on his face, the anger he was holding in check. She thought about her life, a long gray road of fear and endurance. She had spent years trying to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to not be noticed. And now, here she was, the center of a storm, with a good man risking his own name and livelihood to stand with her. She was in a cage, but for the first time, she was not alone in her fight. A strange, startling thought bloomed in her mind. "It is a funny thing," she whispered, her voice raspy. She stepped closer to the bars, close enough to feel the cold iron against her cheek. "I have never felt so alive." Eli looked at her, his expression softening with a pained confusion. "Clara!" "No, it is true," she insisted, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "All those years, I was just surviving, just breathing in and out, waiting for the next blow to fall. But now I am fighting. We are fighting. To be locked in this cell, knowing you are out there, it is more life than I have had in years." He reached his hand through the bars. She met his touch, her smaller, colder hand closing around his strong, warm fingers. The contact was an anchor, a jolt of life in the deadening silence. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm, and in that simple, profound gesture, he said everything that his words could not. The telegraph arrived just after dawn. The charges were a misunderstanding, a relic of a family dispute that had died with her husband. The warrant was rescinded. She was free. Sheriff Brody unlocked the cell door with an air of profound relief. Clara stepped out into the bright morning sun, blinking against the light. Her legal troubles were over, but her trial in the court of public opinion had just delivered its verdict. To the people of Ashridge, her arrest and subsequent release did not mean she was innocent. It meant she was a criminal who had gotten away with it. The whispers were louder now, the stares more pointed. Her reputation was not just ruined, it was cemented in scandal. That evening, Eli found her on the ridge behind the house, standing by the two small crosses, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched to the horizon. She had her freedom, but she did not know what to do with it. She was still an outcast, a woman with a past that would forever define her. Eli came to stand beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a comfort. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," she admitted. "I cannot stay here. Eli, not like this. I bring you nothing but trouble." "You are wrong," he said, turning to face her. The setting sun cast his face in lines of gold and shadow. His expression was serious, his gaze unwavering. "You brought life back to this place. To me." He took a breath. "The last time I asked you to marry me, it was for the wrong reasons. It was a shield, a business deal to protect you from the town. I am asking again, Clara, not for protection, not out of pity." He paused, and his next words were the simplest, most powerful she had ever heard. "You do not owe me your past, but I want your future." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He was not trying to erase her scars. He was offering to build a life alongside them. He wanted her, Clara, not some sanitized version of a woman she could never be. He wanted her future. It was a future she had not dared to imagine for herself. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting of hope. "Yes, Eli." They were married 3 days later, not in the church that had scorned her, but under the sprawling branches of an ancient cottonwood tree by the creek. The sky was their cathedral, the wind in the leaves their choir. Mrs. Grady stood as their witness, her face set in a look of fierce, proud approval. The other witness was the young stable boy from the livery, a boy of 16 with honest eyes who had always been kind to Clara, who knew nothing of the town's gossip and cared only that Mr. Morgan had asked him to come. Eli's words were simple, spoken in his low, steady voice, a promise not of ease or comfort, but of steadfastness. Clara's voice was quiet but clear, a promise to stand with him, just as he had stood with her. He slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger. It was not her sister's ring, which she had quietly buried beneath the cottonwood tree, laying a painful ghost to rest. This was her own. The news of the wedding swept through Ashridge like a prairie fire. It was the ultimate act of defiance. The scandal was immediate and furious. Cal Tilden and his supporters claimed Eli Morgan had finally lost his mind, that he had been bewitched by a conniving woman of low morals. The town council was aghast. The very foundation of their social order seemed to have been shaken. The next time Eli went into town, the shunning was absolute. Men who had known him for years turned their backs. The council meeting was held without him. He was an outcast now, too. He returned to the ranch that evening, his face grim. He walked into the house where Clara was waiting, a knot of worry in her stomach. He looked at her, his new wife, standing in the warm light of their home. A slow smile touched his lips, a rare and beautiful thing. He had lost a town, but he had gained a world. He had made his choice, and he was finally, truly, home. Their marriage did not bring peace. It drew a line in the sand, and Cal Tilden, finding himself on the other side of it, seethed with a fury that curdled into poison. He had meant to isolate them, to make them pariahs. Instead, they had built a fortress of two, their defiance a daily, silent mockery of his influence. He could not abide being ignored. His hatred, denied the public stage, festered in the dark until it drove him to commit a coward's crime. It happened on a moonless night, the kind of thick, oppressive dark where the prairie seemed to swallow all light and sound. A newly hired ranch hand, a young man named Sam, with a quiet demeanor and watchful eyes, had been unable to sleep. He was walking toward the barn when he heard a faint, furtive scraping sound coming from the direction of the well. His first thought was a coyote or a wolf, but a flicker of movement, a man's silhouette hunched over the well housing, sent a cold spike of alarm through him. He moved silently, keeping to the shadows of the corral fence. As he drew closer, he recognized the stooped, bulky form of Cal Tilden. In Tilden's hand was a large burlap sack, which he was carefully emptying into the well's opening. "What are you doing?" Sam's voice, though quiet, cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Tilden spun around, a choked cry of alarm escaping his lips. His face, caught in a sliver of starlight, was a mask of guilt and panic. He saw the young ranch hand, and his panic turned instantly to rage. He lunged, not with the sack, but with a heavy rock he snatched from the ground. Sam, young but quick, dodged the first wild swing, but the second caught him a glancing blow on the side of the head. He staggered back, his vision exploding in a flash of white-hot pain, and fell to the ground. Tilden stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving, before dropping the rock and scrambling for his horse, fleeing into the darkness like the venomous creature he was. It was Clara who found Sam an hour later, a bloody, semi-conscious heap by the well. Eli was out checking on a pregnant heifer, and she had come outside looking for Sam to help. The sight of him, and the acrid, unfamiliar chemical smell hanging in the air around the well, told her everything she needed to know. A year ago, she would have panicked, would have run screaming for help. Now, a cold, clear calm descended upon her. She was the mistress of this ranch, and it was under attack. She helped the dazed and bleeding young man back to the house, her movements efficient and sure. She cleaned the gash on his head, her touch gentle but firm, her past experience tending to her husband's drunken injuries now repurposed for an act of healing. She stitched the wound with a steady hand, her face grim with a controlled fury that was more terrifying than any shouting. When Eli returned, he found Sam resting in the spare room, his head bandaged, and Clara in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, organizing. The well was contaminated. That was the immediate, life-threatening problem. "He will live," she told Eli, her voice tight. "But the well is poisoned. We cannot touch it. We will have to haul water from the creek until we can drain it and clean it." She was no longer the fragile woman he had found crumpled in the dust. She was a general planning a campaign. For the next week, she was the heart of the operation. She organized a small crew, Eli, a stunned but recovering Sam, and herself, to fix the damaged system. She directed the draining of the well, the scrubbing of the stone lining, the painstaking process of ensuring their water was safe again. She worked as hard as the men, her hands blistering, her back aching, her resolve like iron. Eli watched her, a sense of awe mixing with his rage toward Tilden. He had married a survivor. He was just beginning to realize he had married a queen. The attack on the well sent a tremor through the sparse community of ranchers. It was one thing to gossip and shun. It was another to attempt murder. The act was too vile to be ignored, and it forced people to choose a side. A few of their neighbors rode over, their faces grim. An old, respected rancher named Abernathy brought 2 of his sons and a wagon full of clean water barrels. "A man's well is sacred," he said, his voice a low growl. "Tilden has crossed a line no decent man can stomach." But they were the exception. Most stayed away, their silence a clear message. They were afraid of Tilden, or they simply did not want to be caught in the crossfire. The world of Eli and Clara Morgan shrank, their isolation becoming more profound. But the loyalty of the few who stood with them became a bond stronger than steel. The bitterness of the town's rejection did not break Clara. It transformed her. She saw the cruelty of the world, and instead of letting it crush her, she decided to build something to stand against it. One afternoon, she approached Eli with an idea. "The barn," she said. "The old section we are not using for hay. I want to clean it out. On Sundays, I want to open it up." Eli looked at her, confused. "For what?" "For them," she said, her gaze directed toward the distant, dusty track that led to town. "For the ones the town has forgotten. The ranch hands who lost their jobs, the families with too many mouths and not enough flour, the children with no shoes. I will make soup and bread. Anyone who is hungry can come. No questions asked. No price to pay." It was a quiet act of charity, a rebellion waged with ladles and loaves of bread. The first Sunday, only a handful of people came, drawn by the scent of simmering beef stew. They were wary, their eyes darting around as if expecting a trick, but Clara met them with a warm bowl and a simple, welcoming nod. By the third Sunday, 24 people were gathered in the clean-swept barn, their quiet gratitude a more powerful prayer than any she had heard in the town's church. Watching her move among them, a quiet word here, an extra piece of bread there, Eli felt a shift in his own heart. For years, his life had been about holding on, about surviving the past. Now, for the first time, he began to think about building a future. "We could buy the Abernathy parcel next spring," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the last of their Sunday visitors depart. "Expand the herd. There is enough good grazing land to double our stock." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes wide. He was not talking about getting through the winter. He was talking about years from now. He was talking about growth, about a life that was not defined by the ghosts behind them, but by the horizon ahead. It was a language she was only just beginning to learn. For the first time since she had stepped off that train in Ashridge, she saw a future that was more than just the absence of pain. It was the possibility of joy. That possibility was nearly extinguished by fire. A dry autumn had left the territory a tinderbox. They had ridden into town for supplies, a rare trip they made together. When they saw the smoke, it was thick and black, billowing from the center of town. As they drew closer, a horrifying sight met their eyes. The small, one-room schoolhouse was engulfed in flames. A crowd had gathered, a chaotic scene of shouting men and screaming women. A bucket brigade was forming, but it was a pitifully inadequate response to the raging inferno. The schoolteacher, a young woman with a face white with terror, was sobbing hysterically. "2 of them are still inside," she shrieked. "Mary and Sarah. They were in the cloakroom." A collective gasp of horror went through the crowd. No one moved. The front of the building was a solid wall of fire, the doorway a roaring mouth. To go in was suicide. But Clara heard the names, Mary and Sarah, and she did not see a burning building. She saw a small, quiet room, smelled the scent of milk and lavender. She saw a tiny hand curled around her finger. Daniel. The memory was a physical blow, a pain so sharp it propelled her forward. Before Eli knew what was happening, she had slipped from the wagon and was running toward the schoolhouse. "Clara, no!" Eli's shout was lost in the roar of the fire. She did not head for the front. She ran around to the side of the building, to the small windows of the cloakroom. Smoke was pouring from the frame. Tying a handkerchief from her pocket around her face, she grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from a nearby stack and smashed the window. She pulled out the remaining shards of glass with her bare hands, slicing her palms and forearms, but she did not feel the pain. She hoisted herself through the opening and dropped into a room filled with choking, black smoke. It was like being plunged into a blind, suffocating hell. Heat seared her lungs. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was clearer, and crawled forward, shouting the girls' names. She heard a faint whimper from the corner. Two small figures were huddled together under a heavy wool coat, crying in terror. "Come on," she yelled, her voice a raw croak. "You have to come with me now." She grabbed them, one under each arm, and began to drag them toward the window. They were small, but in her smoke-starved state, they felt like lead weights. The roof groaned ominously above them. A burning beam crashed down, blocking their path. For a terrifying moment, she thought they were trapped. Then she saw another window, higher up, with a surge of adrenaline born of pure desperation. She lifted the first girl, shoving her through the opening into the arms of Eli, who had appeared on the other side, his face a mask of frantic terror. As she was lifting the second girl, a section of the ceiling gave way. A shower of burning embers and hot ash rained down on them. Clara shielded the child with her own body, a searing pain lacing across her back and arms as the fire kissed her skin. She pushed the last girl through the window, then felt Eli's strong hands grab her, pulling her out of the inferno just as the rest of the roof collapsed with a deafening roar. She lay on the ground, coughing, gasping for clean air, her body screaming in pain. The town doctor was there, and the grateful, weeping parents of the two girls. As Eli carried her to the doctor's office, the faces in the crowd were no longer hostile or suspicious. They were filled with a stunned, grudging awe. The whispers that followed her now were different. "She saved them. Did you see? She went right in. She saved the children. The woman they had branded a whore had just become a hero." The shift in perception was a balm to Clara's spirit. But it was a threat to Cal Tilden. He saw the town's admiration for her as a personal betrayal. His power, his very identity in Ashridge, was built on being her chief accuser. He could not allow her to become a saint. And so, from the depths of his own rotten soul, he dredged up one final, monstrous lie. He started the rumor in the saloon, where men were most willing to believe the worst. "Think about it," he said, his voice a confidential, poisonous whisper. "Is it not a little too convenient? A woman with a ruined reputation suddenly becomes a hero. What if she set the fire herself? A small fire, just to get some attention, to win sympathy, but it got out of hand." The lie was vile, unthinkable, but in a town that had nursed its suspicion for so long, it found fertile ground. Doubt began to creep back into the conversations at the Mercantile, the seed of Tilden's malice taking root. Clara heard the accusation a few days later. Her burns were healing, but her heart broke open anew. To have an act born of the purest, most painful part of her soul twisted into something so ugly was a cruelty beyond anything she had endured. This time, she did not retreat. She did not hide. She found Cal Tilden holding court on the porch of the Mercantile, repeating his foul story to a group of ranchers. She walked straight up to him. Eli was across the street, securing their wagon, and had not seen her. She faced Tilden alone. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking, but low and fierce. The crowd fell silent. Tilden turned, a smug, contemptuous look on his face. "Speak of the devil," he sneered. "Come to confess, have you?" "You are a poison, Cal Tilden," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You feed on the misery of others because your own life is empty and bitter. I went into that fire because I know what it is to lose a child, a grief you could never understand. And you coward, you would use that. You would use two little girls' terror just to hurt me." Tilden's smug expression faltered. Her words, spoken with the pure, ringing clarity of truth, had struck home. The men around him shifted uncomfortably. Cornered and exposed, he fell back on his only remaining weapon, brute force. "You watch your mouth, you filthy!" he snarled, taking a step toward her and raising his hand. He never finished the sentence. Eli had seen the confrontation and was moving, his face a storm cloud of black rage. He crossed the street in seconds. Just as Tilden reached for Clara, Eli's fist shot out, a single, brutally efficient blow that caught Tilden square on the jaw. The sound was a sickening crack of bone on bone. Tilden's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Sheriff Brody arrived to a silent, tense street, his eyes taking in the scene. Tilden out cold in the dust, Eli standing over him like an avenging angel, and Clara, shaking but unharmed, at his side. The crowd was a silent jury, their verdict clear in their eyes. The sheriff looked down at Tilden, then at Eli. He knew this was not an assault. It was a long overdue reckoning. He nudged Tilden with his boot. "Someone get him on his horse," he said to the crowd. Then he looked directly at Tilden's dazed friends. "And you tell him this for me. He has until sundown to be out of this county. If I see his face in this town again, I will not be responsible for what happens. I will not stop the hanging myself." That night, back at the ranch, the silence was deep and profound. The last great battle had been fought and won. Eli sat on the edge of their bed, gently tending to Clara's burns, his touch more tender than she had ever imagined. He carefully wrapped clean bandages around her arms, his brow furrowed in concentration. The pain from the burns was a dull throb, but the pain in her heart was finally, blessedly, gone. She watched his hands, strong and calloused, moving with such care on her damaged skin. He had stood by her, had fought for her, had protected her, but that was not the root of what she felt. The root was in the quiet moments, in the way he had listened by the fire, in the silent ride home from the church, in his simple, profound acceptance of her, scars and all. He had not tried to fix her or save her from her past. He had simply made a space for her to be whole. As he finished tying the last bandage, she reached up and touched his face. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes full of a deep, unspoken emotion. "I love you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she would not let fall. "Not because you saved me, but because you saw me." The winter loosened its grip on the high plains with a slow, grudging reluctance. The snow receded, lingering in the shadowed hollows, but the sun grew warmer, and the wind lost its vicious, icy bite. Spring arrived not as a soft, gentle guest, but as a fierce, tenacious survivor. Tiny purple wildflowers, no bigger than a thumbnail, pushed their way through cracks in the rock. The pale green shoots of new grass appeared, dotting the vast, sleeping brown of the prairie. The land was harsh, but it was alive, and in its stubborn, rugged beauty, Clara saw a reflection of her own soul. The peace that had settled over their ranch after Cal Tilden's departure was like that spring, hard-won, fragile, and deeply precious. Her life had found a new rhythm, one that extended beyond the boundaries of the ranch. Her literacy, once a private comfort, became a public service. It began with the young wife of a ranch hand, a timid girl who missed her family back in Ohio and could not form the letters to tell them so. Clara sat with her at the kitchen table, her pen moving across the paper, translating the girl's halting, homesick words into a bridge that spanned 1,000 miles. Word spread quietly, carried by women on their infrequent trips to the mercantile or during shared chores at community gatherings. Soon, others came. A widow who needed help understanding a deed left by her husband. A mother who wanted to write to a son who had gone west in search of gold. A young woman, secretly in love with a cowboy, who was too shy to speak her heart, but was willing to let Clara's ink do it for her. Clara became their scribe, their confidant, in helping them find their voices. She solidified her own. She was no longer the scandalous woman from Ashridge. She was Mrs. Morgan, a woman you could trust with your secrets and your words. The ranch, too, was blossoming under the new season of peace. Eli's talk of expansion became a reality. He bought the neighboring parcel from old Mr. Abernathy, and their land now stretched all the way to the creek. The herd grew, the brand of their linked M a common sight on the rolling plains. The silence that had once haunted the property was replaced by the sounds of life. They hired 2 helpers, orphaned boys from a town a county over who had been living on the charity of a tired preacher. Peter was 14, wiry and quick, with a shock of red hair and a mind for horses. His younger brother, James, was 12, quiet and observant, with a gentle touch that made him a natural with the skittish calves. They arrived with all their worldly possessions in a single flour sack, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Clara took one look at their worn-out clothes and hungry faces and saw 2 saplings in need of good soil. She filled their bellies with stew, mended their shirts, and gave them a home. The small room off the kitchen that had once been hers became theirs. The ranch was no longer just a house and a barn. It was a sanctuary, a small, thriving place built not on blood, but on a shared need for belonging. The sound of the boys' laughter echoing in the yard was a sweeter sound to Eli and Clara than any bird song. One hot afternoon in early summer, a rider approached the ranch, not from the main road, but across the open prairie. As if she were fleeing, her horse was lathered, and she rode with a desperate, panicked urgency. As she drew closer, Clara saw that it was a woman, her hair flying loose from its pins, her dress torn at the shoulder. She slid from the horse before it had even come to a full stop, stumbling toward the porch where Clara stood. "Are you Mrs. Morgan?" the woman gasped, her eyes wide with terror. There was a dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek, chillingly familiar to Clara. "I am," Clara said, her voice calm as she helped the trembling woman onto the porch. "What is your name?" "Anna," she whispered. "My husband. He is a freighter. We were camped a few miles from here. He was drinking. He said he was going to... I ran. I heard in town. They said you were a good woman. They said you might help me." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. A good woman, the very thing she had believed she could never be again. She looked at Anna's terrified face and saw herself, a ghost from a not-so-distant past. "You are safe here," Clara said, the words a sacred promise. "Come inside." She knew what had to be done. There was no question, no hesitation. She took Anna to the big hayloft in the barn, a place that was warm and airy and easily defended. She made a bed for her in the soft hay, brought her food and water, and sat with her, not pressing for details, but simply offering her quiet, steady presence until the woman's terrified sobs subsided into exhausted sleep. This was who she was now, not just a survivor, but a guardian. The husband came 2 days later. He was a big, brutish man with a red face and cruel, small eyes, and he rode into the yard as if he owned it. He bellowed for his wife, his voice thick with rage and whiskey. Clara met him on the porch. Eli stood just inside the doorway behind her, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle that was always mounted there. "My wife is here," the man snarled, dismounting. The whelp at the livery stable said he saw her ride this way. "Send her out." "There is no one here by that name," Clara said, her voice as cold and hard as river stone. "Do not lie to me, woman," he said, taking a step toward the porch. "I know she is here. She is my property, and I have come to collect her." "She is not your property." Eli's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous, as he stepped out onto the porch to stand beside Clara. "And you are not welcome here. Leave now." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking from Eli's resolute face to the rifle in his hands. Just then, 2 more riders came around the side of the barn, their own rifles held casually but purposefully across their saddles. It was Mr. Abernathy and the rancher whose saddlebags Clara had mended. They had seen the freighter ride in and had come to stand with their neighbors. They said nothing, simply positioning their horses to block the man's exit, their faces grim and determined. The freighter looked at the 4 of them, 2 men armed and ready, a woman whose eyes held a fire he did not understand, and an old rancher whose reputation for fairness was known throughout the territory. He was a bully, and his courage dissolved in the face of true, united strength. He spat on the ground, a final, useless gesture of defiance, then climbed back onto his horse and rode away without another word, his back stiff with impotent rage. After he was gone, Clara went up to the hayloft. Anna was huddled in the corner, weeping with a mixture of terror and relief. Clara sat down beside her and took her hand. In that moment, looking at the woman she had just protected, Clara understood the full arc of her own journey. She had not just escaped a life of pain. She had been forged by it. The fire that should have destroyed her had tempered her into steel. Her survival was not an end, but a beginning. Her purpose, she now saw, was not simply to live, but to ensure that other women like Anna had a chance to live, too. The day of their first anniversary arrived on a wave of late summer heat. It was the anniversary of the quiet ceremony under the cottonwood tree, a day that had marked the beginning of their real life together. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender, Clara took Eli by the hand. "Walk with me," she said. She led him not to the cottonwood tree, but down the familiar path toward the creek. She led him to the very riverbank where he had found her that terrible night, scrubbing at her skin, trying to wash away a past that felt like a permanent stain. The memory of her despair hung in the air, a ghost they both acknowledged with a shared, silent glance. But tonight, it had no power over them. The moon rose, full and white, casting a path of liquid silver across the gently flowing water. The air was warm, filled with the soft chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods. Without a word, Clara began to unbutton her dress. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable in the soft light. This was not an act of seduction, but of revelation. She let the dress fall to the ground, then her chemise, until she stood before him in the moonlight, her skin pale and luminous. The burn scars on her back and arms were silvery lines, a map of her survival. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the largest scar on her shoulder with a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. Then, he too began to shed his own clothes, the barriers of the day, until he stood before her, his own body a testament to a life of hard labor and old battles. They stood there for a long moment, 2 scarred but whole people, letting the moonlight and the warm night breeze wash over them, a quiet, sacred baptism. She stepped into the cool water of the creek, the same water that had once felt so cold and unforgiving. She turned to him, her face illuminated, a genuine, joyful smile gracing her lips. He followed her in, and the water swirled around them. He took her in his arms, and she leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. She tilted her head back, looking up at the endless, star-dusted sky. A gasp of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her lips. "I have never felt so alive," she whispered. And this time, The words were not born of a desperate fight for survival in a dark jail cell. They were born of peace, of love, of a future that stretched before them as vast and as bright as the Wyoming sky. He lifted her from the water, his arms strong and sure, and carried her to a soft patch of tall grass on the riverbank. They lay down together, their bodies intertwined, the cool night air on their damp skin. They knew that the past would always be a part of them, its pain a faint, lingering echo like the memory of a long-healed wound. But they also knew that what they had built together, this life, this love, this sanctuary, was stronger still, wrapped in each other's arms, under the silent, watchful gaze of the moon. They were finally, completely, home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.